I'm giving you a first look at my HO scale layout featuring the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad right now on the main track. Hey everyone, great to see you here again on the main track. I wanted to thank everybody first of all for tuning in today. We just reached 700,000 viewers on our YouTube channel, so I definitely appreciate everyone's support here over the years. Now, in our last couple of episodes, I gave a little preview of my HO scale layout and promised I'd show you more. So today we're going to take a look at what I've got going on. Some quick details about my layout. Right now it's pretty much a switching layout, 2 feet wide by 20 feet long. And as I mentioned, getting ready to expand that quite a bit, and that'll be plenty of content for some future episodes. My layout itself is set in the late 1980s, and as I mentioned, features the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad's Sedalia subdivision, which was part of the main line to St. Louis, Missouri. Now, the location for my layout, at least for the portion I have done so far, is the city of Sedalia, Missouri, hence the Sedalia subdivision name. Now, starting off the tour, my layout picks up at this curve right here. Now, in real life, around this curve looking toward the north would have been the interchange with the crossing with the Missouri Pacific main line, which linked Kansas City and St. Louis. Now, I'll model that sometime in the future, but because of spacing limitations, I had to pick up things right here at this spot. Our first grade crossing is 3rd Street. The real crossing here had signals, but that's a project for another time, and for now, we have these crossbucks doing the job. Now, first up, you'll notice this large empty lot right here. This will eventually be the site of the Sedalia Katy Depot. Now, here's a picture I took recently of the big depot. You can see it's now a visitor center for the Katy Trail State Park, which is a hiking and biking trail built on the old right-of-way of the railroad that I'm now modeling. Well, by the time frame that I'm modeling, the big Katy Depot was actually closed and the railroad had moved into a small boxcar structure converted into a station across from the main station. Now, the little boxcar depot makes a pretty interesting subject for modeling. Right now I have this old Athearn 40-foot boxcar standing in. I painted it in the correct colors, but I'm going to go back at some point and add the windows and doors, do a lot more of a detailed model right there. But for right now, this is standing in, doing a pretty good job. Now, back to the main line, we have this turnout for a spur track that heads to the Sutherland's lumber yard. We'll show you that here in a few moments. There's also an engine track. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad kept at least one locomotive here in Sedalia for switching the local industries. Now, our next crossing is 5th Street, the building right here. Pretty close model to a structure that actually stood on the other side of the street, but I had to put it right here to give enough room for that big depot that'll eventually go in. And right after the 5th Street crossing is the start of the small yard. You can see it was a pretty tiny facility for the most part, mostly used for breaking up and putting together small local trains and things like that for traffic coming in and out for the local industries. Now, there were also some additional yard tracks at the Missouri Pacific interchange that I showed you that would have been back around that corner that'll be modeled sometime in the future. And this here is the Sutherland's Lumber Yard and Home Improvement Store, which received cars of inbound lumber. Now, in later years, late 1980s that I'm modeling, most of those loads were coming in on center beam cars. Now, on my layout here, I've got pretty tight curves, right around 30-degree radius, and center beams aren't going to look exactly nice. They're going to hang over quite a bit. So until I go back in the future, maybe put in some broader curves, I'm having to use shorter cars, and I'm using 50-foot box cars to bring in those lumber loads. And you can see right now the lumber sheds are empty, and I'll be working on filling that with some scale lumber. That's going to be quite a project, cutting down those small, tiny HO scale 2x4s and pieces of plywood, but that's going to be something I can do and fill the racks here in the lumber sheds. The one thing I've received a lot of comments for on the small portions I've showed you of the layout already are my utility poles. I've always liked railroad line poles and high voltage lines and whatever other utility lines are going to be located in the vicinity of railroads. I think those can be a really important part of creating a scene. Obviously, you've got all kinds of utility lines, high voltage, lower voltage, and so I've done my best to replicate those, especially this line that parallels the Katy tracks, and I've also included these railroad line poles off to the side as well. Now, our small yard comes to a close right here. Now, in the late 1980s, this track right here, this outer line, was actually a dead-end stub, and so trains had to simply back into this. It was mostly used for a layover track for the local trains that ran into and out of Sedalia here. But I needed a way to run around my trains. I needed a passing track, so what I did is I simply reconnected this to make a passing siding. Now, next up, the railroad crosses over US Highway 50, also called Broadway Boulevard, on this neat overpass. Concrete walls on the side, walkways, metal girder bridge, definitely more of an Art Deco feel. Now, this is another example of me trying to build a model that's as close as possible. It's not an exact replica, but I did my best with the dimensions and such to make a pretty good representation of that. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that there are actually two separate spans on this complex of bridges right here. The farthest one out, the eastern side of the bridge, that was the two-track bridge for the Katy line. Now, on this closer side, the western half of the bridge was a single track for the Missouri Pacific, which actually had a branch line and industrial track that paralleled the Katy through town. Now, the MOPAC took out its track in the late 1970s or early 80s, and when they did that, this span was simply left in place, minus the rails. All right, so going past the bridge, we come to the massive brick Missouri Public Service Power Plant. Pretty big, imposing structure, as you can see, that actually stood through the late 1990s. Now, the plant itself closed in 1977, so by the time I'm modeling right here, the facility had been shuttered for a few years and the spur tracks were long gone. Interestingly enough, there was also a massive 250-foot smokestack right behind here, but that was gone by the early 1980s. Would have been a pretty cool element to model. Trying to make it at scale size would have towered over the entire layout, but to keep things as appropriate for the time frame that I could, I went ahead and left that out of the power plant complex. Next up here is the 10th Street crossing. You can see this is kind of where most of my layout progress ends for the moment. I have a little bit of scenery done so far, but don't have any ballast on the tracks. I'm still working on the trackage right there, working on the rest of the scenery, but you can kind of see where things are going and get a good idea. For this crossing right here, I put in some of the roadway just to get an idea of where that's going to go, kind of visualize that. This is where a spur broke off and headed to the rival manufacturing plant. It was one of the biggest industries in Sedalia at the time. The company made appliances for kitchens, things like crock pots and such. Now, my model of the rival plant itself still in the works, but that'll be taking up quite a bit of real estate here on the corner of the layout. And then here my main line continues around this curve, waiting for the layout to be expanded right around there. All right, so that's kind of the lowdown of what I have constructed so far. Let's head back to the other side of the layout there at the 3rd Street crossing. We have that GP39-2 short local train, so we're going to go ahead and run that across the layout and then back it into our passing track here. All right, so there you have it, the debut of my Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad Sedalia Subdivision HO layout. I hope you've enjoyed what I have so far. As I mentioned, getting ready to double and pretty close to triple the size of this, so there's going to be lots and lots of work to go. And as with any layout, it's pretty much a work in progress. So go ahead and leave me a comment on what you think. If you have any questions about anything you saw today, I'd love to hear from you. That'd be great stuff that we can cover in some of the future episodes. So look forward to getting to work here and showing you my progress in future episodes. As always, thanks for joining us here on the main track.